Hey, I'm Jesse. Let's have a devotion. We are surveying the story of Joseph because of the incredible forgiveness that Joseph showed. I think that's a crucial element to properly enduring seasons of lamentation, recognizing the instruments of God's discipline in your life, your fellow sinners, as exactly that, instruments in the sovereign hand of God. The close of Lamentations, though it ends on this miserable cliffhanger, such as the nature of the human experience this side of heaven, it does acknowledge the sovereignty of God, the fact that God's in control. That helps us forgive. Knowing that God is sovereign and not our enemies helps us forgive our enemies. Knowing that God is sovereign helps us endure seasons of discipline. Here's Genesis 45. Okay. Joseph is he's been so sketchy. He's been so weird. He's been plotting and kind of scheming and manipulating things a little bit. He's not pristine and sinless. He foreshadows Jesus, but that's mostly in ways that he can't really control. All right. There's some things that he does that are amazing, but I think that's wrong of us to try to, sort of put Joseph on a pedestal and elide the things that he does that are sinful and manipulative and weird. And when we try to paint this picture of Joseph as this pristine, forgiving, Christ foreshadowing figure, and we overlook the ways in which he did do some weird manipulative stuff, I think it actually makes his particular brand of forgiveness seem less attainable. When we look it full in the face and we see how Joseph was weird just like we are, and Joseph would claim to be totally healed of his past trauma, but obviously wasn't. Yet in the end, he does forgive. That actually makes the story more applicable to people like me, at least, who struggle with a sin nature. Here's Genesis 45. You're going to see Joseph bring the house down, tell him who he is, and ultimately acknowledge that God's the one who's sovereign over the whole thing. I want you to look for the link between his acknowledgement of the sovereignty of God and then his ability to forgive his own brothers who had sold him into slavery. Joseph could no longer keep his composure. We've skipped ahead. We've skipped ahead like a couple of chapters. He's no longer able to keep his composure in front of all of his attendants. So he called out, "Send everyone away from me." No one was with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers. But he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and also Pharaoh's household heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But they could not answer him because they were terrified in his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near me." And they came near. "I am Joseph, your brother," he said, "the one you sold into Egypt. And now don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there will be 5 more years without plowing or harvesting. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land, to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God." That's critical right there. "He has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Return quickly to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me without delay. You can settle in the land of Goshen and be near me, you, your children, and your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and all you have. There I will sustain you, for there will be 5 more years of famine. Otherwise, you, your household, and everything you have will become destitute. Look, your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin can see that I'm the one speaking to you. Tell my father about all my glory in Egypt and about all you have seen, and bring my father here quickly.' Then Joseph threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin wept on his shoulder. Joseph kissed each of his brothers as he wept, and afterwards his brothers talked with him." Here it is, the long anticipated moment the big reveal, the reconciliation, and at its core, Joseph's acknowledgement that God's really the one who sent him there. It wasn't just the pettiness among his brothers, their jealousy for their favoritism that Jacob showed Joseph. And it wasn't just little Joseph's running his mouth and talking about the visions of grandeur, all of which have come true in the last few days at this point in the narrative, by the way. It wasn't any of that. It was the sovereign hand of God. It was the sovereign hand of God. It was the sovereign hand of God. That's why Joseph was, frankly, sold into slavery. That's why Joseph was put in the pit. That's why Joseph found himself in Potiphar's house. That's why Joseph was in prison. That's why Joseph was interpreting dreams. Joseph was there to save the lives of the line of the covenant with Abraham. These are the progenitors of the nation of Israel that still exists today, for crying out loud. And none of that would have been possible were it not for Joseph's imprisonment. Had Joseph died, had Joseph not been there, the people would have starved during this famine, because Joseph is put strategically in position. When he's in position, even that prison term that he served, it wouldn't have happened. They would have become destitute. They could have died in a famine. But God orchestrated all of this to such effect that even Israel's on the news today because of this. God is sovereign. When we zoom out and we see the redemptive plan of God at work through all of this, the bitterness between Joseph and his brothers seems comparatively petty. And Joseph will acknowledge that in the devotion text we look at tomorrow, from the very final chapter of Genesis. Bringing this home, if you are currently in a season of lamentation and you've been under the discipline of God and it's weighed heavily upon you, would you emphasize right now in prayer to God your acknowledgement of the fact that you see that he's in control, not your enemies, not even you. He's sovereign. He's the one who reigns from generation to generation. He was sovereign over Joseph and his brothers, and look at how God delivered Israel even today through these events. God is sovereign. He's on his throne from generation to generation. Who knows generationally what God might accomplish through that season of discipline in your life? When you acknowledge that God's the one who's in control and God is good, it will cause your bitterness and your temptation untoward grudges for the instruments of God's discipline upon you in your life to shrink radically by comparison. And they seem petty. It doesn't mean that they don't matter. It doesn't mean that your feelings weren't legitimate. But it does reframe them quite redemptively. Focus on the sovereignty of God. Acknowledge that he's the one who's brought you to where you are. And then that makes it easier to forgive your brothers who have harmed you.